6 months. That's how long the billionaire wanted to stay married. Not forever, not even a year.
Marry me for 6 months.
6 months. Then I leave. That was the deal. And if you'd asked me that day how our story would end, I would have told you the easiest part was always going to be saying goodbye. I was wrong. Because on day 180, Adrienne Sloan was standing in her driveway begging me not to leave. And the worst part was that by then, she wasn't the only one afraid of goodbye. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The ending of this story changed everything. Before we get there, take a quick second to join the community by hitting subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Marry me for 6 months, then leave.
Adrienne Sloan said it so calmly that for a second I honestly thought I'd misheard her. I was sitting across from one of the richest women in North Carolina, in an office larger than my entire warehouse, listening to a proposal that sounded less like a marriage and more like a business transaction. She slid a thick stack of papers across her father's old desk and told me everything I needed to know was inside. The contract explained that certain shareholders were trying to challenge her control of Sloan Global after her father's death, and according to the company's legal structure, a marriage would strengthen her position and protect crucial voting rights. The details were complicated, but the purpose was simple. She needed a husband on paper, nothing more. As I turned the pages, it became obvious that Adrienne had thought through every possible detail. There were clauses about public appearances, confidentiality, living arrangements, and even how media questions would be handled. What struck me wasn't how strange the agreement was. It was how emotionless it felt. Adrienne never talked about companionship, trust, or building a life together. She spoke the same way someone might discuss an acquisition or a merger. This wasn't a relationship in her mind. It was a solution to a corporate problem. When I finally looked up from the contract, she met my eyes and made it clear that neither of us should confuse the arrangement for anything else. 6 months, 180 days. After that, we would go our separate ways and never owe each other another thing. Then I reached page 9. Halfway down the page sat a single paragraph that seemed to matter more than everything else combined. The marriage would automatically terminate on day 180. No extensions, no negotiations, no emotional complications. The ending had already been written before the beginning even existed. I read the sentence twice, then a third time, trying to understand how anyone could approach marriage with that level of certainty. The whole thing felt wrong. It felt cold. It felt like something no reasonable person should agree to. My first instinct was to refuse immediately. In fact, I nearly did. I pushed the contract away and started telling myself all the reasons this was a terrible idea. I barely knew Adrienne. I didn't belong in her world. The entire arrangement felt like a disaster waiting to happen. Then she mentioned the compensation package. The number was large enough that I thought I'd heard it wrong. It wasn't just good money, it was life-changing money, the kind of money that could erase years of financial pressure in a single afternoon. And that's when I thought about Ruby. I thought about the overdue bills sitting on my kitchen counter. I thought about the repairs my moving company desperately needed. I thought about all the nights I'd stayed awake pretending not to worry while secretly calculating how many more months I could keep everything afloat. Most of all, I thought about my daughter trusting me to figure things out the way she always had. Every reason to say no suddenly collided with every reason I needed to say yes. The longer I sat there, the harder the decision became. Every instinct told me this arrangement was a mistake, but instincts wouldn't pay for Ruby's future. Instincts wouldn't protect the business I'd spent years building. Eventually, the silence between Adrienne and me grew so long that it felt impossible to ignore. I picked up the pen, stared at the signature line for a few seconds, and signed my name. The moment the ink touched the paper, I had exactly 180 days before my marriage was supposed to end. Yeh section du ka tighter version hai. Target approximately 650 words ke aspas. The first rule of our marriage was simple. We had to look convincing. The second rule was even simpler. We couldn't become real. I learned both rules the morning after I signed the contract. Adrienne had her legal team walk me through the details in a conference room overlooking downtown Charlotte. The contract wasn't just a marriage agreement. It was a complete strategy. There were rules for public appearances, media interviews, charity events, business functions, and investor meetings. We would attend important events together. We would be photographed together. We would answer questions as husband and wife. To the outside world, the marriage had to look completely authentic because the entire arrangement depended on people believing it was real.
What surprised me wasn't the number of rules. It was how carefully Adrienne had planned everything. There seemed to be a prepared response for every possible situation. If reporters asked how we met, there was a version of the story. If investors asked about our future together, there were approved talking points. If anyone became too curious about our personal lives, there were boundaries neither of us was supposed to cross. The entire thing felt less like a marriage and more like a corporate project. Then Adrienne pointed to the section she clearly cared about most. Our private lives remain separate. She said it calmly, but there was something firm underneath the words. We would share public responsibilities, nothing else. No expectations. No emotional obligations. No confusion about what this arrangement was supposed to be. Honestly, that wasn't the part that worried me. Adrienne Sloan was still a stranger. The difficult part was figuring out how to explain any of this to Ruby. That evening, I sat across from my daughter at the kitchen table, trying to find a version of the truth that wouldn't sound completely ridiculous. Ruby listened quietly while I explained that I would be helping someone through an important business situation, and that our lives might be changing for a while. She stared at me for several seconds before asking the one question I had been trying to avoid. Are you getting married? Kids have a remarkable talent for cutting through complicated explanations. A little, I said. Ruby frowned immediately. A little married isn't a thing. The worst part was that she was absolutely right. The conversation only became more difficult from there. She wanted to know if Adrienne was moving in with us, if we were moving in with Adrienne, and why anybody would get married if they already planned to stop being married later. I answered as honestly as I could, but every explanation sounded strange the moment it left my mouth. By the time we finished talking, I wasn't sure which of us was more confused. A few days later, we moved into Adrienne's estate. Calling it a house felt dishonest. The place was enormous. There were security gates, private gardens, guest wings, and enough empty space to make the entire property feel strangely lonely. Adrienne remained polite, professional, and distant. She never treated Ruby badly, and she never treated me badly either, but there was always a wall around her that nobody seemed allowed to cross. Every conversation felt measured. Every interaction felt controlled. Ruby noticed it almost immediately. Does she ever smile? She asked one evening. The question caught me off guard because I had been wondering the same thing. As far as I could tell, Adrienne spent most of her life carrying responsibilities that left very little room for anything else. The bigger surprise came when we started attending public events together. To cameras and reporters, everything looked perfect. Adrienne knew exactly how to play the role of a billionaire CEO. Investors respected her. Executives listened to her. Journalists followed her everywhere. But whenever those same people turned their attention toward me, something changed. Some were polite. Others treated me like I barely existed. At one charity dinner, a man spent several minutes discussing our marriage with Adrienne without asking me a single question. Another guest assumed I worked for her. One woman seemed interested in talking to me until she learned I owned a moving company. The moment she heard that, the conversation died. I started noticing the pattern everywhere. In Adrienne's world, people were often judged by titles, wealth, and status. In my world, people were judged by whether they showed up and did the work. The contract might have made us husband and wife on paper, but the longer I spent inside Adrienne Sloan's world, the more I realized just how far apart our lives really were.
Moving into Adrienne Sloan's estate felt less like moving into a home and more like stepping into a museum where people happened to live. The place was enormous. Long hallways connected rooms I couldn't imagine anyone actually using, and every piece of furniture looked expensive enough to have its own security system. Ruby loved it immediately. She spent the first hour exploring corners of the property while I tried to convince myself that this arrangement was temporary and that, in 180 days, we'd be back to our normal lives. Adrienne, meanwhile, seemed completely unaffected by the size of the place. She moved through it the same way someone walks through an office they know too well. Most mornings, she was already working before I woke up. Most nights, she was still working when I went to bed. Her days seemed to consist of meetings, phone calls, reports, and endless decisions that affected thousands of employees. The strange thing wasn't how hard she worked. It was how alone she looked while doing it. Ruby noticed it before I did. One evening we were sitting on the patio watching the sunset when she asked, "Why does Adrienne always eat dinner by herself?" I didn't have an answer. The question stayed with me because the more I paid attention, the more I realized Ruby was right. Despite living in a house full of people, Adrienne seemed isolated from all of them. The staff respected her, but they never relaxed around her. Conversations ended the moment she entered a room. Employees straightened their posture when she walked by. Even simple interactions felt tense, as if everyone was terrified of disappointing her. At first, I assumed that was just what happened when someone ran a billion-dollar company. Then I started noticing small things that didn't fit that explanation. Every now and then I'd catch Adrienne staring out a window after a meeting ended. Sometimes she'd pick up her phone, look at it for a few seconds, then put it away without calling anyone. Once I saw her sitting alone in a library large enough to hold hundreds of books, doing absolutely nothing for nearly 10 minutes. She looked less like a powerful CEO and more like someone who had forgotten how to stop carrying the weight of her own life. Ruby, being Ruby, decided this was a problem she needed to solve. She started saying good morning to Adrienne every day. Then she began leaving little drawings outside her office door. Most people would have stopped after getting almost no reaction. Ruby doubled down. One afternoon, she even left a handwritten joke on Adrienne's desk. Nothing happened. At least not immediately. A few days later, I walked into the kitchen and found Ruby explaining knock-knock jokes to a visibly confused billionaire. Adrienne was trying very hard to maintain her usual serious expression, while Ruby insisted on repeating the punchline until it became impossible not to understand. Then something unexpected happened. Adrienne laughed. It wasn't a big laugh. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it was real. Ruby looked so proud of herself that I thought she might burst. The moment passed quickly. Adrienne caught herself almost immediately and returned to her usual composed expression. But I had seen it. More importantly, Ruby had seen it. For the first time since I met her, Adrienne Sloan didn't look like a billionaire CEO protecting herself from the world. She looked like an ordinary woman who had forgotten what it felt like to enjoy someone's company. And for the first time, I started wondering whether the person hidden behind all those walls was very different from the one everyone else thought they knew. The dinner was held at a private country club just outside Charlotte. One of those places where everything looked expensive enough to make you nervous about touching it. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Waiters moved around carrying trays of food I couldn't pronounce, and every conversation seemed to involve investments, acquisitions, or vacation homes somewhere I'd never been. I'd been there less than 15 minutes before someone asked what department I worked in. When I explained that I owned a moving company, the smile on his face tightened almost immediately. He wasn't rude about it. That's the thing about wealthy people. The really experienced ones rarely insult you directly. They simply find ways to remind you that you're standing in a room they don't think belongs to you. Over the next hour, it happened again and again. One woman spent 10 minutes asking Adrienne questions about our marriage without looking at me once. Another guest seemed genuinely interested in talking until he learned what I did for a living. After that, he suddenly remembered someone else he needed to speak to. Through all of it, Adrienne remained calm and professional, carrying herself exactly the way everyone expected a billionaire CEO to carry herself. If the comments bothered her, she didn't show it. I started telling myself I could survive one uncomfortable evening. Then Marcus Bell walked over. Marcus didn't waste time pretending. He shook my hand, looked me up and down once, and smiled the way people smile when they've already made up their minds about you. "I'll admit, Wes, you're not what I expected," he said loud enough for several nearby guests to hear. When I asked what that meant, he glanced around the room and said, "Let's just say most people assumed Adrienne would marry someone who understood this world." A few people laughed into their drinks, not loudly, just enough. For a moment, nobody said anything, including Adrienne. Marcus took that silence as permission to continue. He asked whether I planned to go back to moving furniture after the contract ended, and the way he said it made it sound like he'd asked whether I planned to return to digging ditches. I could feel people waiting to see how I'd react. The funny thing was, I wasn't embarrassed by my work. I'd spent 20 years helping families move into new homes, helping businesses survive relocations, helping people carry entire chapters of their lives from one place to another. So I smiled and said, "Yeah, I probably will. Somebody has to do it. Judging by tonight, half the people in this room wouldn't know which end of a couch to pick up." The laughter that followed sounded different from the laughter before. This time it wasn't aimed at me. Marcus smiled, but it wasn't the same smile he'd started with. And when I finally looked toward Adrienne, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. For the first time all night, she looked genuinely uncomfortable, not because of me, but because of what everyone else had been trying to do to me. The first time I realized how much Adrienne hated talking about her father happened at breakfast on a quiet Sunday morning. The three of us were sitting on the patio behind the estate, and for once Adrienne wasn't looking at her phone or answering emails. It was probably the most relaxed I'd seen her since our arrangement began. Ruby was drawing in a sketchbook while Adrienne slowly worked her way through a cup of coffee. Everything felt normal right up until Ruby asked a question that changed the entire mood of the morning. "What was your dad like?" The words were innocent. Ruby wasn't trying to dig into old wounds. She was 9 years old and naturally curious about people. But the reaction was immediate. Adrienne's expression changed so quickly it felt like someone had flipped a switch. Her shoulders tightened. The small trace of comfort that had been there a moment earlier disappeared completely. For a few seconds, she simply stared at her coffee. "He worked a lot," she finally said. Ruby nodded. "My dad works a lot, too." I almost stepped in and changed the subject, but something about Adrienne's face stopped me. There was more behind that answer than she wanted to admit. Ruby, completely unaware of the tension she'd stumbled into, kept asking questions. Did he like sports? Did he tell jokes? Did he take vacations? The more she asked, the shorter Adrienne's answers became. Eventually, Ruby asked the question that made everything stop. "Did you love him?" The silence afterward felt heavy. Adrienne looked away toward the gardens. "That's complicated." Ruby frowned. "I don't think it is." I nearly choked on my coffee. Adrienne actually looked surprised. Most adults spent their lives choosing careful words around her. Ruby never did. She simply said what she thought and expected honesty in return. For a moment, Adrienne seemed unsure how to respond. Then she stood up. "My father wasn't a very easy person to know." That answer should have ended the conversation. Instead, it opened the door. Over the next few days, little pieces of the story started slipping out. Never all at once, never intentionally. Sometimes it happened during dinner, sometimes during a drive, sometimes after a long day when Adrienne seemed too exhausted to keep every wall standing. I learned that Benjamin Sloan had spent most of his life building the company that eventually made him a billionaire. I learned that Adrienne had grown up surrounded by responsibilities, expectations, and pressure. Most importantly, I learned that she blamed him for far more than his absence. She blamed him for missed birthdays,
missed graduations, missed family moments, missed years. The way Adrienne talked about him, you'd think every disappointment in her life eventually traced back to Benjamin Sloan. What struck me wasn't the anger. It was how fresh it still sounded. The man had been dead for almost a year, yet every conversation about him felt unfinished. Nothing about it resembled grief that had settled with time. It felt more like an argument that had never actually ended. One evening, Ruby found an old photograph sitting in a hallway cabinet. It showed a younger Adrienne standing beside her father at what looked like a company event. She carried the picture into the living room and stared at it for several seconds. "You look happy here." Adrienne glanced at the photo. "No, I wasn't." Ruby studied it again. "Are you sure?" Adrienne didn't answer immediately. Ruby pointed at the image. "Because that's not what your face looks like." The room became very quiet. I remember watching Adrienne stare at the photograph longer than she probably intended. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked uncertain. Not angry, not defensive, just uncertain. Ruby sat beside her on the couch. "My mom used to say people can be two things at the same time." Adrienne looked down at her. "What does that mean?" "It means somebody can hurt your feelings and still love you." Nobody spoke after that. A few minutes later, Ruby wandered off to finish her drawing, completely unaware of what she'd left behind. Adrienne remained sitting there with the photograph in her hands. She kept looking at it as if she were seeing something different than she had seen before. And for the first time since her father's name entered our lives, she didn't seem completely certain she was right about him. A few days after the board dinner, I started noticing something strange. The people around Adrienne seemed to know more about our arrangement than I did. It wasn't anything obvious, just small comments that didn't quite fit. A lawyer mentioned that Benjamin Sloan had been remarkably specific before his death. One of the senior executives referred to me as the man he selected. At first, I assumed they were talking about the marriage contract itself, but the more I heard, the less comfortable I became. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I asked Adrienne directly. The reaction on her face told me she didn't know what they were talking about either. That was the first sign something bigger was hiding beneath the surface. Up until that moment, both of us had believed the arrangement existed because of a legal problem. Suddenly, it seemed possible the legal problem wasn't the whole story. A week later, we found the first piece of evidence. Adrienne's attorneys were reviewing old estate documents when one of them discovered a set of instructions Benjamin Sloan had left before his death. Buried among pages of financial directives and corporate paperwork was my name. Not a general description, not a recommendation, my actual name. Benjamin Sloan had specifically requested that if certain conditions arose after his death, Adrienne should approach Wes Carter, me, a moving company owner from Charlotte who had never met him. I still remember the silence that followed when the attorney finished reading the document. Adrienne looked as confused as I felt. "That doesn't make any sense," she said. Honestly, I agreed. Wealthy men like Benjamin Sloan didn't spend their final months planning around people they'd never met. Yet there it was in black and white. The contract marriage hadn't been created after his death. In some form, it had been anticipated long before it happened. The discovery bothered both of us for completely different reasons. Adrienne couldn't understand why her father would hide something so important from her. I couldn't understand why he would choose me. For the next several days, we started digging through old files, searching for anything that might explain the connection. Most of what we found only created more questions. Then, one afternoon, buried inside a box of archived correspondence, Adrienne discovered a name neither of us expected to see. My wife's name. Emily Carter. For a moment, I genuinely thought there had to be some mistake. Emily had passed away 6 years earlier. She had never worked for Sloan Global. She had never talked about knowing Benjamin Sloan. Yet there she was in company records from nearly a decade ago. The information itself wasn't dramatic. It was just enough to prove a connection existed. Years earlier, Emily had apparently participated in a community housing project funded by one of Benjamin Sloan's charitable foundations. Her name appeared several times in internal reports. Benjamin's appeared alongside it. The record suggested they had met on multiple occasions. Not often, not enough to explain everything, but enough to establish that they knew each other. Adrienne and I spent hours reviewing documents, hoping the next page would finally explain why any of this mattered. It never did. Every answer seemed to uncover another mystery. Why had Emily never mentioned him? Why had Benjamin followed our family afterward? Why had he specifically requested me? Neither of us could find a single explanation that made sense.
For the first time since signing the contract, our marriage stopped feeling like a random legal arrangement. Until then, I'd believed I was simply a convenient solution to a corporate problem. Now that explanation felt incomplete. Benjamin Sloan had planned something. Whether it involved Adrienne, Emily, me, or all three of us, I couldn't tell. What I did know was that a billionaire businessman had somehow connected his daughter's future to a widowed moving company owner years before either of us understood why. As strange as our situation had already been, it suddenly felt much larger than a temporary marriage. Adrienne seemed to realize it too. The questions were getting bigger, the answers were getting stranger, and for the first time, both of us were following a mystery neither of us understood. The breakthrough came from a place neither Adrienne nor I had thought to look. By that point, we'd spent days digging through company archives, estate records, old correspondence, and foundation documents trying to understand why Benjamin Sloan had connected his daughter's future to mine. Every answer seemed to create three new questions. Then one afternoon, one of Sloan Global's senior attorneys called Adrienne and told her there was something she needed to see. An hour later, we were sitting inside a records room buried deep in the company's headquarters, staring at a small sealed envelope that had been discovered inside a locked estate file. The envelope looked ordinary, no markings, no company logo, nothing special about it at all. The only unusual thing was the name written across the front in Benjamin Sloan's handwriting. It wasn't Adrienne's name. It wasn't the name of an attorney or board member either. It was mine. For several seconds, neither of us said anything. Adrienne looked at the envelope, then at me, then back at the envelope again. The attorney seemed just as confused as we were. According to the accompanying documents, Benjamin had specifically instructed that the letter remain sealed unless certain conditions involving the company occurred after his death. Those conditions had apparently been met. The attorney handed me the envelope and quietly left the room. The moment the door closed, the silence became almost uncomfortable. "Open it," Adrienne finally said. Her voice sounded calm, but I could hear something underneath it. Confusion, maybe even concern. I carefully broke the seal and unfolded several handwritten pages. The first sentence hit me harder than I expected. "If you're reading this, Wes Carter, then events have unfolded more or less the way I hoped they would." I remember reading that line twice before continuing. Benjamin's writing was clear and direct. He didn't waste words. He explained that he had first met my wife, Emily, years earlier through one of his community housing projects. According to the letter, Emily had impressed him almost immediately. She volunteered long hours, treated people with kindness when nobody was watching, and seemed genuinely committed to helping others. Benjamin admitted that he had remained quietly aware of our family long after the project ended, not in some intrusive way, more like a distant observer. Over the years, he occasionally received updates through foundation staff, mutual contacts, and community partners. He learned when Emily became sick. He learned when she passed away. He learned that I continued raising Ruby alone. The deeper I read, the stranger the letter became. Benjamin wasn't writing about business. He wasn't writing about money. He was writing about character. He described moments from my life that I barely remembered myself. A fundraiser I'd helped organize after a local storm. A family I had assisted during a difficult move, even after learning they couldn't pay the full amount. Small things, ordinary things. The kind of decisions nobody expects a billionaire to notice. Yet somehow he had. Then came the sentence that changed everything.
Benjamin wrote that throughout his life he had learned something unfortunate about wealth. Money could measure success, but it couldn't reliably measure trust. According to him, truly dependable people were surprisingly rare. He believed I was one of them. I lowered the pages for a moment and looked at Adrienne. She hadn't said a word since I started reading. Her expression had become impossible to read. Slowly, I continued. The final section of the letter focused entirely on her. Benjamin admitted that he had spent years worrying about his daughter. Not her intelligence, not her ability to run the company. He never doubted either of those things. What worried him was her isolation. He believed success had gradually surrounded her with people who needed something from her. Advisors needed influence. Investors needed returns. Executives needed approval. Very few people seemed willing to care about Adrienne herself. Benjamin wrote that he had failed her in many ways as a father, but before his death he wanted to do one thing right. He wanted to place someone trustworthy in her path. By the time I reached the final page, the room felt completely different. Benjamin wasn't explaining a business strategy. He was explaining a plan. Somehow, years before either of us understood it, he had decided that my family and Adrienne's life would eventually intersect. Whether he expected friendship, healing, or something else entirely, he never said. The last line simply read, "If my daughter lets you, help her remember that she is more than the company she inherited." When I finally lowered the letter, neither of us spoke for a long time. Adrienne was staring at the table as though everything she thought she knew about her father had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. I wasn't doing much better. The marriage no longer felt accidental. The contract no longer felt accidental. Even our meeting no longer felt accidental. For the first time since this strange journey began, both of us were staring at evidence that someone had been quietly guiding events long before either of us knew it. And neither of us knew what to do with that truth. Ruby and Adrienne became friends so gradually that I don't think either of them noticed it happening. At first, their interactions were small. A quick conversation at breakfast, a question after school, a drawing Ruby left on Adrienne's desk. But over the weeks following Benjamin's letter, something started changing. Adrienne began spending less time hiding inside her office and more time around the house. She still worked ridiculous hours, but now she'd occasionally join us for dinner instead of eating alone. She'd ask Ruby about school projects. Ruby would tell her long stories that wandered in 10 different directions before reaching a point. Somehow Adrienne always listened. The woman who could command a boardroom full of executives would sit patiently while a 9-year-old explained why one cartoon character had betrayed another cartoon character. It was strange. And honestly, it was kind of beautiful. The biggest difference wasn't what Adrienne said. It was what she stopped doing. She stopped acting like every conversation was a meeting. She stopped treating every moment like it needed to be productive. Around Ruby, she laughed more. Not often, not dramatically, just enough to make me realize how rarely I'd seen her relax before. One Saturday afternoon, I found them sitting on the floor of the library, surrounded by colored pencils and construction paper. Ruby was teaching Adrienne how to make greeting cards. The fact that a billionaire CEO was taking arts and crafts instructions from a child with complete seriousness nearly made me laugh out loud. What surprised me more was the look on Adrienne's face. For the first time since I'd met her, she seemed comfortable, not successful, not powerful. Comfortable. Of course, Ruby noticed things adults missed. She always had. One evening, the three of us were watching a movie when Adrienne received a phone call from one of her executives. The moment she answered, her entire posture changed. Her shoulders tightened. Her voice became controlled, professional. By the time the call ended, the relaxed woman from 5 minutes earlier had disappeared. Ruby watched her for a few seconds before asking a question that made both of us pause. "Why do you always act like everything's okay when it's not?" Adrienne looked genuinely caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Ruby shrugged. "You look sad sometimes. Then somebody walks into the room and you pretend you're not." The room went quiet. Kids don't realize when they've wandered into the middle of something important. They just tell the truth and leave everyone else to deal with it. Something shifted after that. Not immediately, but over the next few days, Adrienne started opening up in ways she never had before. She told us stories about growing up in her father's shadow, about constantly feeling like she needed to prove herself, about inheriting a company everyone expected her to run perfectly while privately wondering if she was failing every single day. She never turned those conversations into dramatic confessions. They felt more like someone finally getting tired of carrying heavy boxes alone and deciding to set a few of them down. Listening to her reminded me of conversations I'd once had with Emily. My wife had always been able to look past what people showed the world and notice what they were hiding underneath. More than once, while watching Adrienne talk with Ruby, I caught myself thinking about Emily and wondering what she would have said about all this. The strange thing was that the memories no longer hurt in the same way they once had. For years, thinking about Emily usually came with a sharp reminder of everything we'd lost. Now those memories felt different, softer somehow. Maybe because I could see traces of the qualities Emily valued most appearing inside this house. Kindness, honesty, connection. The walls Adrienne had spent years building weren't collapsing all at once, but cracks were appearing everywhere. She trusted Ruby. Ruby trusted her. And somewhere along the way, I realized I trusted her too. The contract still existed. Day 180 was still coming. The rules hadn't changed. Yet more and more often I would catch myself forgetting that any of this was supposed to be temporary. For the first time since signing that agreement, our marriage no longer felt like something we were pretending to be. It was starting to feel dangerously close to something real. The night everything changed started like any other night. Ruby had finished her homework, complained about having to brush her teeth, and spent 10 minutes trying to convince me that her bedtime should be negotiable. By the time the house finally grew quiet, I remember feeling grateful for the normalcy of it. Looking back now, that's what I remember most. Nothing felt wrong. There was no warning, no sign that within a few hours I'd be reliving one of the worst fears of my life. I woke up sometime after midnight to the sound of Ruby struggling to breathe. At first I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard it again. I was out of bed before I was fully awake. When I reached her room, she was sitting upright, terrified, fighting for every breath. The sight hit me like a punch to the chest because I'd seen it before. Years earlier, I'd watched illness slowly take my wife away. In that moment, every fear I'd buried came rushing back at once. The next few minutes passed in a blur. I grabbed my keys, carried Ruby to the car, and drove faster than I probably should have. She kept trying to tell me she was okay, the way kids do when they can see their parents panicking, but I could hear the strain in her voice. Every red light felt too long. Every minute felt dangerous. By the time we reached the hospital, my hands were shaking. Doctors and nurses moved quickly, asking questions while they rushed Ruby through a set of double doors. Then suddenly she was gone, surrounded by people in scrubs, and I was left standing in a hallway with nothing to do except wait. I've always believed waiting is one of the hardest things a parent can experience. When someone you love is hurting and there's nothing you can do to help, every second feels heavier than the last. I don't know how long I sat there before Adrienne arrived. I never called her. I barely remembered calling anyone. Yet somehow she knew. One moment I was alone in the waiting area staring at the floor, and the next she was sitting beside me asking what the doctors had said. She was still wearing the clothes she'd had on earlier that evening, which meant she'd left the house the moment she heard. I expected her to stay for a few minutes and then leave. Instead, she stayed. Hour after hour. She brought coffee I never drank. She spoke to nurses when I couldn't focus. She handled phone calls I didn't even realize were coming in. Most importantly, she never once tried to make the situation about herself. As the night dragged on, old memories started surfacing. Sitting in that hospital brought back images I hadn't thought about in years. The smell of disinfectant, the endless waiting, the helplessness. I found myself thinking about Emily and those final months when every hospital visit carried questions nobody wanted answered. At one point, I buried my face in my hands because I genuinely didn't know how much more fear a person could carry. Adrienne didn't offer empty reassurance. She didn't tell me everything would be fine. She simply moved her chair closer and sat beside me. Sometimes that's all people need. Not solutions, presence.
Just before sunrise, a doctor finally came out with an update. Ruby was stable. More tests would be needed, but she was breathing normally again. I felt so much relief that I nearly collapsed. For several seconds, I couldn't even speak. The first thing I saw when I looked up was Adrienne wiping tears from her face. She turned away immediately, but not before I noticed. In all the months I'd known her, I'd never seen that side of her before. The powerful CEO was gone. The carefully controlled billionaire was gone. Sitting beside me was simply a woman who cared deeply about a little girl and had been terrified of losing her. When the doctor finally allowed visitors, Adrienne followed me into Ruby's room without hesitation. She stood beside her bed looking more relieved than I could remember seeing anyone. Watching them together, I realized something fundamental had changed. The contract still existed. Day 180 was still approaching, but whatever this relationship had started as, it wasn't that anymore. Somewhere during the longest night of our lives, the center of everything had shifted, and neither of us could pretend otherwise. Here's a Section 10 version closer to the competitor style, with larger flowing paragraphs and around the requested 450-word range. Ruby's recovery was slow, but every day seemed a little better than the one before it. A few days after she returned home, I found her sitting at the kitchen table coloring pictures while Adrienne helped her with a school project. Watching them together felt strangely normal. A month earlier, I never would have imagined Adrienne Sloan spending her evening helping a 9-year-old cut construction paper into uneven shapes. Yet there she was, completely focused on making sure Ruby's poster looked perfect. The hospital had changed something. Not overnight, not dramatically. But the distance Adrienne usually kept between herself and everyone else seemed harder for her to maintain now. She spent more time with us. She joined us for meals. Sometimes she'd simply sit in the same room without pretending she had somewhere more important to be. For the first time, she seemed less interested in protecting herself. One evening, after Ruby had gone to bed, Adrienne and I sat on the back patio looking out over the gardens. Neither of us spoke much at first. Eventually, she broke the silence herself. "Do you know something funny?" she asked. I told her I probably didn't. She stared out into the darkness for several seconds before answering. "Most people think being rich means you're surrounded by people who care about you." There was no bitterness in her voice, just exhaustion. She told me about former friends who disappeared the moment they couldn't benefit from knowing her. She told me about relationships that had started with promises and ended with requests. According to Adrienne, wealth attracted attention easily. What it didn't attract was trust. "After a while," she said quietly, "you stop wondering whether people like you. You start wondering what they want." Listening to her, I realized how lonely that kind of life must be. For reasons I still don't fully understand, her honesty made me honest too. I told her things I normally kept to myself. I told her about the years after Emily died, about pretending to be strong for Ruby while privately feeling terrified half the time. I admitted how often I worried about failing as a father, how every major decision felt heavier because there wasn't another parent standing beside me anymore. Adrienne listened without interrupting. She didn't try to solve anything. She simply listened. It sounds simple, but genuine listening is rarer than most people realize. By the time we finally went inside, something important had shifted between us. We weren't just two people fulfilling the terms of a contract anymore. We had started becoming friends. Real friends. The kind who knew where the scars were hidden. Neither of us called it that. Neither of us talked about what it meant. But from that point forward, I found myself looking for Adrienne whenever something good happened. And more surprisingly, she seemed to be doing the same thing with us. For a little while after Ruby's hospital scare, it felt like life was finally settling down. Then Marcus Bell reminded us that peace never lasts very long around powerful people. The first sign of trouble appeared in the form of a news article questioning the legitimacy of Adrienne's marriage. At first it seemed harmless. Then another article appeared, then another. Within a week, financial blogs, business reporters, and industry analysts were all discussing the same thing. Why had one of the most powerful CEOs in the country suddenly married a struggling moving company owner? The question itself wasn't the problem. The problem was that someone was feeding information to the media. Someone wanted people asking those questions. Neither Adrienne nor I needed long to figure out who that someone probably was. Marcus never attacked directly. He was too smart for that. Instead, he allowed other people to raise concerns on his behalf. Board members started questioning whether the marriage had been arranged purely to secure voting control. Investors began demanding explanations. Reporters showed up outside company events looking for comments. What had once been a private agreement suddenly became public controversy. Every headline seemed designed to create the same impression, that Adrienne had manipulated corporate rules to protect her position. The fact that the accusation wasn't entirely false made defending it even harder. For the first time since our arrangement began, I saw genuine fear behind Adrienne's confidence. Her authority wasn't disappearing overnight, but it was being weakened piece by piece. The worst part was realizing that I had become the easiest target. Nobody could attack Adrienne without consequences. Attacking me was simple. Commentators described me as unqualified, opportunistic. Some suggested I'd been paid to play a role. Others implied I was taking advantage of a vulnerable billionaire. Reading those stories made me sick. More importantly, they were hurting Adrienne. Every day the pressure increased. Every day Marcus gained a little more ground. Eventually I started wondering whether the simplest solution was to leave. If I ended the arrangement early, maybe the attacks would stop. Maybe the company would stabilize. Maybe Adrienne could save herself from the damage my presence was causing. I was seriously considering that possibility when everything changed. Late one evening, Adrienne received a call from one of her father's estate attorneys. During a routine review of Benjamin Sloan's personal archives, they had discovered another sealed envelope hidden inside a private records box. Unlike the first letter, this one had never been cataloged with the rest of the estate documents. It appeared to have been intentionally concealed. The attorney wouldn't discuss the contents over the phone. He simply said that both of us needed to see it immediately. I remember looking across the room at Adrienne after the call ended. For weeks we'd been chasing answers that only created larger questions. Now another letter had appeared at the exact moment everything seemed to be falling apart.
Neither of us knew what Benjamin had written. Neither of us knew why he'd hidden it. What we did know was that the future we'd been worrying about an hour earlier suddenly felt much less important than whatever waited inside that envelope. Because if Benjamin's first letter had changed how we viewed the past, something told me the second one was about to change everything else. The next afternoon, Adrienne and I sat across from each other in Benjamin Sloan's old office with the second letter resting between us. Neither of us spoke much before opening it. The first letter had already changed how we viewed her father. This one felt heavier somehow, more personal. When Adrienne finally unfolded the pages, I could see her hands trembling slightly. For the first few minutes, she read in silence. Then she handed the letter to me. Benjamin got straight to the point. He wrote that he knew Adrienne would probably spend years believing he cared more about the company than he cared about her. He admitted there were times when that belief wasn't entirely unreasonable. He had missed birthdays, missed family dinners, missed moments he could never get back. He didn't try to defend those mistakes. Instead, he acknowledged them one by one. What struck me most was how honest he sounded. There were no excuses, no attempts to rewrite history. Just a father admitting that success had cost more than he understood at the time. Then the letter shifted. Benjamin explained that the company had never been the reason he chose me. In fact, according to him, the company was almost secondary. What truly worried him was Adrienne herself. Over the years, he had watched wealth slowly isolate her from ordinary life. Every relationship became complicated by money. Every friendship came with questions about motives. Every success pushed her further away from people who simply cared about her as a person. Benjamin wrote that long before his death, he began fearing that his daughter was becoming surrounded by influence, but starved of connection. That was where Ruby and I entered the story. Benjamin explained that after meeting Emily and quietly following our family's journey, he saw something he couldn't buy for Adrienne. He saw a home built around loyalty instead of status. He saw a father and daughter who relied on each other completely. He saw the kind of love that survived hardship because it wasn't dependent on wealth, power, or expectations. According to Benjamin, the life Ruby and I were living represented something he desperately wanted his daughter to experience before it was too late. The final pages were addressed directly to Adrienne. Benjamin wrote that he never wanted to find her a husband for the company. He wanted to help her find a family. He admitted that he couldn't repair the mistakes he'd made as a father, but he hoped he could leave behind one final gift. Not money, not business advice. People. People capable of caring about her without needing anything in return. By the time I finished reading, the room had gone completely silent. Adrienne was staring at the letter through tears she wasn't even trying to hide anymore. For years, she had believed her father chose the company over her. Now she was holding proof that one of the last decisions of his life had been made entirely because of how deeply he loved her. Watching that realization settle over her felt like watching years of anger slowly lose their grip. For the first time since I met her, Adrienne wasn't fighting her father's memory. She was finally beginning to understand it. Day 180 arrived far faster than either of us expected. For months, that number had existed somewhere in the distance, a deadline written into a contract that always felt too far away to worry about. Then, suddenly it was there. The company was secure. The voting dispute had been resolved. Marcus Bell's challenge had collapsed after Benjamin's letters became impossible to ignore. Sloan Global was stable again. The legal purpose of our marriage had been fulfilled exactly as planned. By every measurable standard, the arrangement had succeeded, which should have made leaving easy. It didn't. The morning began quietly. I spent most of it packing my belongings into boxes that had once seemed temporary. Clothes, photographs, Ruby's school supplies, small pieces of a life that had somehow spread itself throughout the estate over the past 6 months. Every room seemed to contain evidence that we'd actually lived there. A drawing Ruby had taped to a refrigerator, a book I'd forgotten in the library, a blanket she insisted on keeping in the family room. None of it was important, yet every item felt strangely difficult to pack away. Ruby handled the situation better than I expected, at least on the surface. She spent the morning helping me organize boxes while pretending this was all completely normal. Every now and then I'd catch her looking toward the front windows as if expecting someone to stop us. She never said anything directly, neither did I. Some truths become obvious long before anyone is willing to speak them out loud. Adrienne was harder to read. She spent most of the day buried in work, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was how often she seemed to lose focus. More than once I found her staring at documents without actually reading them. She kept finding reasons to walk through rooms where we were packing. Sometimes she'd ask if we needed help. Sometimes she'd comment on something completely unrelated. The conversations never lasted long. They felt less like conversations and more like attempts to delay something neither of us wanted to face. That afternoon, Ruby carried the last box from her room and placed it near the front door. Then she sat beside it without saying a word. The sight hit me harder than I expected. For 6 months, this house had slowly stopped feeling like a temporary address. Somewhere along the way, it had become home. Maybe not because of the building itself, because of the people inside it. As evening approached, the reality of the situation became impossible to avoid. The contract was ending. The boxes were packed. The obligations had been fulfilled. Everything was proceeding exactly the way it was supposed to. Yet nobody seemed happy about it. Not Ruby, not me, not Adrienne. The strangest part was realizing there was no crisis left to solve, no legal battle, no hidden letter, no mystery waiting for an answer. For the first time since our story began, nothing stood between us except a decision. I remember looking across the room at Adrienne that evening and noticing how carefully she was controlling her expression. To anyone else, she probably looked calm, professional, composed. But by then I knew her too well. I could see the effort it was taking. And judging by the way she kept looking toward the packed boxes near the door, she knew exactly what I knew. Nobody in that house wanted to say goodbye. The next morning I finished loading the last box into my truck and stood in the driveway staring at the house that was no longer supposed to be part of my life. 6 months earlier, I'd arrived carrying a contract with an ending already written into it. Now the company was secure, the legal battle was over, and day 180 had finally arrived. Everything had gone according to plan. The problem was that somewhere along the way, the plan had stopped matching reality. Ruby stood beside me holding her backpack, unusually quiet for a child who normally had something to say about everything. Neither of us seemed eager to leave. The front door opened behind us. When I turned around, Adrienne was standing there. For a few seconds, she didn't speak. Then she walked toward us and stopped. "I thought this would be easier," she admitted. "I kept telling myself this was temporary. I kept telling myself I'd be ready when today came." She looked down and laughed softly, but there wasn't any happiness in it. "The truth is, the marriage stopped being fake months ago. I just didn't want to admit it." Hearing those words from Adrienne Sloan felt more shocking than any boardroom battle or hidden letter we'd discovered over the previous 6 months. This was the same woman who once treated our marriage like a business transaction. Now she could barely look at the packed truck without struggling. Before I could answer, Ruby stepped forward. "You know I don't want to leave, right?" she said. Adrienne looked at her, surprised. "You're the first person who's made this place feel like home since Mom died. You're there when I'm scared. You're there when Dad's worried. You're there for everything." Ruby shrugged. "That's what family does." The tears Adrienne had been trying to hide finally appeared. Then she looked at me. "Don't stay because of the contract," she said quietly. "Don't stay because of the contract." A few days after I decided to stay, Adrienne pulled the original agreement out of a drawer in her father's office and placed it on the desk between us. The same document that had started everything. The same 11 pages that had turned a struggling single father and a billionaire CEO into temporary husband and wife. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then Adrienne smiled, tore the contract in half and handed part of it to me. I remember laughing because it felt strangely ceremonial. 6 months earlier, that paperwork had controlled our future. Now, it was just paper. The months that followed were quieter than everything that came before. No boardroom battles, no hidden letters, no media scandals. Just life. Real life. Ruby settled into a routine that finally felt stable. For the first time in years, she stopped asking questions about what might happen next. She didn't worry about moving again. She didn't worry about losing people she loved. She simply got to be a child. Looking back, I think that may have been the greatest gift any of us received. Adrienne changed too. Not overnight, and not because she stopped being ambitious. She remained an exceptional CEO. The difference was that she no longer built her entire identity around work. Inspired by everything Benjamin's letters had revealed, she began reshaping the Sloan Foundation. More resources went toward helping single-parent households, children's health programs, housing initiatives, and community support networks. Every major project reflected something she'd learned during the previous 6 months. The foundation stopped focusing only on numbers and started focusing more on people. Meanwhile, my own life changed in ways I never expected. The publicity surrounding the company battle unexpectedly brought attention to my moving business. New clients arrived. then more. Within a few years, we'd expanded from one truck to several. I hired employees, opened a larger facility, and finally stopped worrying about whether we'd make it through the next month. Success felt good, but the truth is that the business wasn't the thing I valued most. Every evening, I still came home to the same people waiting for me. Years later, after Ruby was nearly grown, I found myself standing in the library one evening looking at a photograph of Benjamin Sloan. By then, I'd spent a long time thinking about the choices he'd made. Most people believed he used a marriage contract to save a company. Technically, that's true. The contract protected Sloan Global exactly as he intended. But the older I got, the more I realized that wasn't the real purpose behind any of it. Benjamin had spent his final years worrying about a daughter who felt alone, a widowed father trying to hold his family together, and a little girl growing up without the security she deserved. The company was never the most important part of the story. The contract wasn't either. They were simply the tools he used to solve a different problem. In the end, Benjamin Sloan didn't bring together a CEO and a single father. He brought together 3 lonely people who needed each other before it was too late. And somehow, against every reasonable expectation, he got it exactly right.